Okay, so now we're going to talk about the strength of your preference and the remaining three dimensions or sets of preferences. So in terms of the strength, what you need to do is look at the numbers affiliated with your particular personality type. In this particular case, we're going to use the hypothetical examples of Jim and Lou. Now, what it reads down here is that the numbers represent the strength of preference. If you have a 1 to roughly 25, that means you have a slight preference for one over the other. So if you had a 1 extroversion, that means you slightly prefer extroversion to introversion. A 26 to 67 number represents a moderate preference or a medium level preference for action. And 68 to 100 represents a strong preference. So if we look at Jim and Lou, both are ENFPs, but on the continuum, they are much, much different in 3 cases. They're very similar on the feeling dimension. They're both a 1%, which means they have a slight preference for it. Which means that if they were asked 100 questions about thinking and feeling, they probably answered 51 as a feeler and 49 as a thinker. So they really could go in either direction depending on the decision at hand. The extroversion, you will see 100 for Jim, 64 for Lou. Jim has a really strong preference for extroversion, while Lou only has a moderate one. Similarly, Jim has a very strong preference for intuition, while Lou has a slight preference for it. And in this particular case, Lou happens to be very strong as a perceiver, and Jim is only at 22%. So when we're talking about all these things, you need to put yourself more on a continuum of these preferences, where you, versus being really categorical, you just have to think how strongly this really fits with you. And it doesn't mean that the scaling doesn't work. It just means this is where you fall on a continuum. Okay, now in terms of the sensing and intuitive dimension, this is how we process information. And intuitive types are, when they are in touch with something or information, they look at possibilities via the unconscious. So they're not looking consciously as or processing that in a conscious way, but rather they tangent based on the object at hand and perceive possibilities associated with it. And I'll give you an example in just a minute. They do not process information necessarily using the 5 senses, which is why the term sensor applies, because sensors focus more on looking at things with the detail that's in front of them using their senses. So intuitives are looking at the relationship to an object based on a wide range of experiences. So what I often do in a class is I give people baseballs, and I tell them, write down everything that comes to mind as you describe the baseball. So here it is, they have information in front of them, the baseball, and they're trying to process it. And what we find is that the people who are intuitives are much more likely to write about all sorts of tangential things to the ball, like baseball, a baseball game, the pitch, the home run that I saw last week, the dirtiness of the uniforms, my favorite team, because when they're processing information, it has to do with a lot of different things versus what's right in front of them. So when I do this exercise with them, they often hear the term, write down everything that comes to mind, versus they describe the baseball. So when you compare lists, the people with the baseballs who are intuitives tend to have very long lists. They could keep going forever, versus sensors who really look at the details of the ball and will write down, white stripes, red stripes. They write down little details about the ball that's on there. They might bounce the ball up and down, say hard, clean, things like that, because that's based on what they can see, smell, touch, etc. Okay, so sensors tend to be very observant with their senses. And when they do this exercise, they tend to describe the baseball. So they're done pretty quickly. They look around. They say, wow, what is everybody else doing? Because they describe the baseball, and that's all they were asked to do. That's how they're processing information. So to make the comparison, sorry, this keeps happening. I'm having a trouble. There we go. Okay, so sensors are very realistic. They are detail-oriented people. So when they process information, they look at the details. They're very realistic. When they process it, they're looking at specific parts or details, and they like communication that's literal and concrete. Now, they may seem really observant, really detailed, and very literal-minded compared to intuitives. On the flip side, intuitives tend to be very theoretical, imaginative, big picture thinkers. They like patterns and meaning, and they don't mind communication that's abstract and figurative. They like patterns or relationships between things, and they may seem fickle or impractical, because what can happen on a team is, then say you're brainstorming a project. Intuitives are great at brainstorming because they can come up with all sorts of stuff, but they may not be reasonable or practical to implement. So sensors say, oh, good grief, here comes the intuitive. He or she always has these big picture ideas, but none of them are practical. Whereas the intuitive sees the sensor and says, hey, why can't you get an imagination, be a big picture thinker? Let's think outside the box, think big picture. And so there can be conflict between the two in a similar way that there can be with extroverts and introverts. Thinking and feeling, how people make decisions. This is a very sad example, but I often ask the class, I tell them that they're driving at dusk and that they're rounding a bend and they accidentally hit a deer in the road, and the deer hits the car and then falls on the ground, and what comes next? And the thinkers will typically come up with very thinking, brain-based decisions, like I call 911 in terms of, I've just been in an accident, or I think about my car and the insurance. I always get somebody jokingly who says dinner. Whereas the feelers, when I give this scenario, will immediately say, oh no, this is terrible. I feel awful. I feel upset. Is the deer okay? What can I do? Do I need to call animal control? Because I feel so bad. And I offer this example because I hit a deer once, and my first inclination was to actually almost cry, and I'm a big feeler. So it's how you make decisions. So if you really want to just think about this generically, it's the head or the heart. People who are thinkers, first and foremost anyway, even though they may think in both capacities, tend to first think in a very logical, cost-benefit, rational way. So they're rational, they're analytical, they follow the rules when making decisions, they're very logical. They don't mind hearing negative feedback as long as they're examples, because then that makes sense to them. And their decision-making tends to be more impersonal, where with feelers, it's more about the people and the principles. So when they're making decisions, they wonder about, how people are going to handle this. They're very good at being emotionally attuned to what is going on with other people. They're very good in helping solve conflicts. They don't necessarily want to give or get negative feedback because it could hurt them or the other party. And they tend to focus decisions on very deeply held principles or underlying beliefs. So, you think about like the CEO who's asked to lay off a bunch of people, who's considering laying off a bunch of people. The thinking CEO would probably think more about, at least initially, how much money are we losing? How many people do we need to get rid of in each department? I say, quote, get rid of, it might be more impersonal. Should it be in one department or across departments? And, what's the effect on the bottom line? Whereas the feeling CEO might initially think, oh my gosh, these people, their families, how are we going to put things into place to help them get other jobs elsewhere? What are we going to do about the morale of the company because this is so upsetting? So it's just a different way of making those decisions. And then lastly is the judging, perceiving dimension. Let me check the time here. Wow, how annoying for me. I had it there. I don't want to lose what we have. Okay, I'm just going to get through this one and then I'll pause it. Judging, perceiving. This has to do with how people relate to deadlines. So if you look at the questions on here, have you ever handed anything early? What time would you arrive to a 12 p.m. flight? Have you ever worked with anyone who likes to have everything scheduled down to the minute? How about a team member who just can't stand to be tied to a rigid schedule? So for example, when you ask, have you ever handed anything in early? The judgers are always the ones who say, oh yeah, I have. Perceivers, never. If you ask who's ever late, judgers, not so much. Perceivers would say, yeah, I'm kind of late or very late. Have you ever worked with somebody who schedules things down to the minute? Judgers. How about the team member who just can't stand to be tied to a rigid schedule? Perceivers. So the distinction here is that judgers tend to be very, very scheduled, that they are very attentive about details around deadlines, and like to take a very organized structured approach to life, whereas perceivers tend to be much more flexible about time and deadlines and their degree of organization in life. So judgers, for example, if you ask people to who has a really detailed calendar, it's always the judgers. They will have really, I would use the term sexy calendars with bracketed off minute by minute events. They often will have even calendars that they have printed out, and they are color coded, and they're very pleased with them. Whereas a perceiver will say, boy, maybe I don't even use a calendar really. So for example, judgers like to plan ahead. They like handling deadlines. It makes them feel good to have deadlines and meet them. They tend to be really well organized. They like making decisions, and then when they make the decision, it's like, whew, they check it off their list. Judgers tend to be list-oriented people. They like creating a list, doing things, and then crossing it off their list. And you're a big judger if, for example, you have your list and then you have gone throughout the day and you're crossing things off your list, and every time you cross something off you feel really good, and then you realize you did something that you forgot to write on your list in the first place, so you write it in and then cross it off, and that feels really good. Whereas perceivers, that's kind of alien. They like to have life under control, and they can seem demanding, rigid, and uptight. I also ask judgers about their closets. Judgers tend to have very well organized closets, the right kind of hangers. Everything's organized according to the type of shirt or pant, whereas perceivers will say stuff's all over the floor, or it's very messy. Perceivers are much more spontaneous. They like to keep options open as long as possible. They will be late. They meet deadlines right at the last minute. And they can seem disorganized, messy, and irresponsible to people. What you're going to be doing in class is that you're going to each talk about your MBTI type as well as the strength of the preference. You're also going to create a team composite and discuss implications for you working together. And we may talk about the types a little bit more.